At the end of an intense night, Dr. Rachel Scott, head of surgery, is about to leave when the intercom buzzes with urgency. A voice on the other end announces a critical case, an accident patient with multiple fractures and massive blood loss. Rachel sighs but doesn't hesitate. She sets aside her coat, ties her hair back, and quickly heads to the emergency room as nurses and residents rush to organize around her. When she arrives, she assesses the situation in seconds. The team is preparing the man for surgery, and Rachel takes charge. He's a man in his 50s, unconscious, with multiple visible severe injuries. Without knowing his medical history, she asks for more information, but a nurse's quick response is concerning. "He didn't have any documents on him, doctor. The police are still working to identify him. He arrived in critical condition." Rachel shakes her head, focusing on stabilizing the patient for surgery. It doesn't matter who he is. What matters is that he survives. Her agile and precise mind already maps out the steps, calculating what must be done with minimal delay. Even when chaos reigns around her, she remains calm. Tonight, everyone depends on that calm. Monitors around the room beep in a disordered symphony, recording the patient's vital signs. Blood pours from one of his wounds, and she quickly identifies the problem, a compromised arterial vessel. This detail prompts her to switch tactics swiftly, her firm voice directing the team with sequential instructions. Vascular suture immediately. We need to stop the bleeding and secure the airway. Rachel keeps her eyes on the injured area while the residents, always attentive, take mental notes. Everything she does or says carries weight, especially for them, who see Rachel as a model of absolute dedication. Her reputation isn't just about flawless technique. It's also about her journey to this position. The youngest daughter of a single mother and one of the few black women in her hospital role, overcoming every obstacle along the way. She adjusts her gloves, her fingers quick and steady, with every movement adding a layer of gravity to her expression. Rachel knows that time is her greatest enemy. Disregarding distractions, she maintains absolute focus on the patient, who remains stable for now, though the situation could worsen at any moment. The surgery advances tensely, and Rachel orders, "Keep an eye on oxygen saturation and bring the arterial bleed stabilizer. Monitor the vital signs closely. The situation is volatile." Her tone is direct, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. She commands the environment with authority and confidence. Known in the hospital for her technical rigor and for a determination bordering on obstinacy, Rachel sees this not as a choice but as a necessity. Every second that passes makes the unconscious man feel like a personal responsibility. Hours go by as she works with the concentration of someone who allows herself to breathe only at the end. Outside, the dark night deepens, but inside the operating room, time is suspended with every move, every muffled sound absorbed by the absolute focus of everyone there. As she sutures one of the most critical areas, a less experienced resident hesitates. Without lifting her eyes, Rachel notices the young man's nervousness and makes a quick gesture for him to adjust one of the instruments. "Trust your training," she says calmly. "Every movement counts." These words are meant for the resident, but also resonate within her. A fleeting memory surfaces, a conversation with her mother years ago. Her mother always encouraged her, even when everything seemed impossible, even when she was the only black woman in her medical school class. Every achievement was a hard-won battle, and today, in that operating room, in an environment that demands nothing less than excellence, Rachel carries those lessons with her. After a long time, she begins finishing the sutures, each stitch almost millimetrically precise. The operating room falls into a deep silence as everyone awaits the patient's vital signs. Rachel watches closely, waiting for any reaction. Then, finally, the monitors indicate stability. The team exchanges glances, and Rachel allows herself a moment of relief. It's not a smile nor a word, it's just a pause. She steps away from the operating table, removes her gloves, and hands over supervision to the nurse beside her, who updates her on the patient's clinical status. It looks like he's out of immediate danger, Dr. Scott. His condition has stabilized. Rachel nods in acknowledgement. She looks at the unconscious man for a moment and takes a deep breath, feeling the weight of the hours spent there. His face is still unknown, an anonymous figure, but in that instant, it feels like something significant has been sealed. Rachel has a vague sense that this case will be remembered, though she doesn't know why. As she leaves the room, her colleagues look at her with respect. Once again, she had led a high-risk surgery without hesitation. To them, she's Dr. Rachel Scott, the surgeon who always gives her best. To Rachel, however, this case is just one of many in her routine, one where someone's life was saved and the cycle closes. Walking down the hallway, she breathes in the air outside the operating room and heads toward the locker room. But as she walks, she notices a group of police officers approaching with worried expressions, speaking discreetly among themselves. She catches a fragment of their conversation. The accident seems to have happened near the main highway, but we're still unsure of the cause. His condition was critical. It's a miracle he made it to the hospital in time. Rachel continues in silence, hearing the officer's words and thinking about the critical minutes she had spent in surgery. She knows she did her best, and despite everything, a sense of duty fulfilled lingers in her mind. 2 days after the surgery, John Harris slowly regains consciousness. He feels the pressure of tubes, the wires connected to monitors, and the uncomfortable weight of vulnerability while lying in a hospital bed. Used to being in control of everything, John stares at the ceiling in frustration, recalling the accident and the searing pain. The silence in the room is interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. The door opens and Rachel enters, holding a tablet with his clinical information. She approaches with her usual professionalism, and John lifts his eyes to meet hers. He observes her features. Her dark skin, serious expression, and a subtle change appears in his demeanor. He keeps his composure, but the initial discomfort is evident. Rachel, well accustomed to such looks, maintains her composure, offering a discreet smile. She is there to reassure him about the surgery and outline what lies ahead. Mr. Harris, I'm Dr. Rachel Scott, the chief surgeon who performed your operation. It's a pleasure to see you awake. I'd like to explain a bit about the procedure and our recovery plan, if you're willing. John nods, but his gaze stays fixed on her with a hardened expression. There's something restrained in his posture, but also judgment, as if he's struggling to process her presence. The surgery? You were the one who performed it? Rachel keeps her light smile, though she already recognizes the nature of the question. His tone carries a hint of disbelief, perhaps even dissatisfaction. She responds with calm confidence. Yes, I was responsible for the procedure. You suffered some serious injuries, but we managed to stabilize everything in time. Now, we'll monitor you to prevent any complications. John listens, but his expression hardens further. His lips press together, and he remains silent for a few seconds, staring at her. His fingers begin to grip the sheets, as if fighting an internal battle to mask something. Then he takes a deep breath, turning his gaze to the corner of the room before speaking again, in a restrained tone. Look, I know you did your job, and he pauses, running a hand over his face, uncomfortable. I just wanted a second opinion. For precaution, you know. Rachel, maintaining her serenity, feels the familiarity of this discomfort. It was the technical request many patients like John made when they wanted someone more appropriate, a white doctor they felt they could trust, to review their case. She listens patiently, waiting for him to elaborate. Could you ask Dr. William to review my case? Or, he hesitates, glancing briefly at her. I want to make sure everything was done correctly. Rachel feels the weight of each word, each reluctant glance, but she chooses to disregard the implications he places there. With the same calm as before, she replies, I understand, Mr. Harris. Dr. William is an excellent doctor. I can have him review your case, of course, but as your attending physician, I'll continue to oversee your recovery and monitor for any potential complications. He nods, though the discomfort on his face remains evident. He avoids looking at her directly, returning his focus to the wall in silence. Finally, Rachel bids him farewell with a final nod and leaves the room, feeling the weight of that brief exchange of looks and unspoken words. Walking down the hallway, Rachel reflects on his request. It wasn't the first time a patient had reacted this way, but it always left a mark. Every request for a second opinion carried a veiled critique, an insinuation that she didn't belong in the position she had earned, as if her presence required justification. Even if patients never declared this directly, she knew how to read between the lines. At the nurse's station, Rachel sees Dr. Williams speaking with a nurse. He notices her and approaches, recognizing her expression. Rachel knows he is a trusted colleague who understands the hospital dynamics. Dr. William, the patient John Harris requested that you review his case. She explains directly. The businessman from the accident? He raises an eyebrow. You've already operated on him, haven't you? Yes. He's in recovery, but preferred a second opinion. It might be easier if you could confirm what I've told him. Dr. William nods, immediately understanding the subtext. He knows that patients like John Harris, however discreet, often carry prejudices that surface in such requests. William, a considerate doctor, heads to John's room while Rachel stays in the hallway, feeling the bitter familiarity of this type of situation. While Dr. Williams speaks with John, Rachel distracts herself with paperwork at the nurse's station, but keeps an ear open. She hears Dr. Williams' calm, firm voice explaining the situation objectively. A few minutes later, he returns. He wanted details about the operation and your decisions. I reinforced that everything was conducted properly. Thank you, Dr. William. He smiles, placing a hand on her shoulder. Don't worry, Rachel. People like him always need to hear what they want, even when what you've done is flawless. Rachel thanks him, but the uneasy feeling remains. She's exhausted from constantly needing to prove perfection to be accepted. For her, every day at the hospital requires patience that shouldn't be necessary, but remains a constant. For days after the surgery, John Harris appeared to be recovering well. His vital signs were stable, and he was able to move more easily, though still with some limitations. He wasn't satisfied with the situation, but he counted the days until he could leave the hospital and return to his life. However, that afternoon, something changed. At the end of her shift, Rachel was urgently called to John's room. When she arrived, she found him visibly uncomfortable, his eyes closed and his face contorted in pain. A nurse monitored his vital signs with a worried expression. Dr. Scott, his heart rate is elevated and his blood pressure is fluctuating significantly. He's reported intense abdominal pain. Rachel nodded, remaining calm but alert. A complication following such a complex surgery was never a good sign, but she knew she needed more information before drawing conclusions. John opened his eyes when he saw her approach, and his expression shifted from pain to something bordering on irritation. Mr. Harris, I'm here to understand what's happening. Can you describe the pain? He observed her in silence for a moment, as if carefully calculating each word before responding. It's intense here. He pointed to his abdomen. And it gets worse every time I take a deep breath. I shouldn't be feeling this, right? Rachel acknowledged his statement with a focused look. It was localized, sharp pain, which could indicate an internal complication. In situations like this, quick action was crucial. She decided to run additional tests to determine the cause of his discomfort. We'll perform an ultrasound and a CT scan to ensure everything is okay internally. He scoffed, clearly displeased. I figured this wouldn't have happened if the procedure had been done correctly. Rachel felt the weight of his insinuation, but remained calm. She had expected such a reaction from John, given his resistance from the beginning. She instructed the nurse to prepare for the test while making notes and checking his condition again. A few hours later, the results came back, and Rachel returned to the room with a serious expression, accompanied by a resident. John looked at her expectantly and wasted no time, giving her an inquisitive look. So, what's the situation, doctor? We've detected a small obstruction in the operated area. We believe it might be your body's reaction to the procedure. It's something that can happen in rare cases, but we'll monitor you closely to see how your body reacts in the next few hours." John squinted, clearly dissatisfied with the explanation. So, something went wrong during the surgery. Rachel kept her gaze steady, refusing to let the accusations shake her. "We followed all protocols. This type of reaction is rare but documented. Even so, close monitoring is the best course of action right now." John grumbled and closed his eyes again. Clearly, he wasn't satisfied, but Rachel realized that any further explanations would only increase his resistance. Knowing this, she left the room silently, determined to provide the best care despite his ongoing doubts about her abilities. As she exited, Rachel overheard a fragment of a conversation between two nurses near the nursing station. One, young and anxious-looking, spoke in a low voice but loud enough for Rachel to catch. "He thinks it was her mistake. I heard him mention it to his family earlier." Rachel paused for a moment, but took a deep breath and continued on her way. She had faced similar situations before, but something about this accusation bothered her deeply. She knew that, despite all her work and experience, John would persist in associating the complication with her supposed error. The following morning, John Harris's condition took an unexpected turn. He began experiencing severe pain again, and his clinical state rapidly deteriorated. Rachel was called to his room urgently and found his condition requiring immediate intervention. The head nurse looked at her with a worried expression. "Dr. Scott, his vital signs are dropping. He's running a high fever and experiencing intense abdominal pain. It looks serious." Rachel approached John, who had his eyes closed and was breathing laboriously. His face was covered in sweat, and his expression revealed evident pain. When he saw Rachel, he tried to lift his head, but the effort caused his breathing to quicken. "Mr. Harris, we need to take you back to the operating room immediately. I suspect the complication we identified yesterday has worsened." "Another surgery?" he muttered, his voice hoarse and expression skeptical. "Maybe I was right to want someone else handling this." Rachel took a deep breath, staying calm and ignoring the comment. She knew that arguing at that moment would only prolong the patient's suffering and risk. She quickly gave instructions to the team as they prepared to move him to the operating room. Minutes later, John was wheeled into surgery, and Rachel prepared to perform the procedure. But before she could begin, Dr. William entered the room, donning his gown and gloves. He looked at Rachel and approached with a neutral but professional demeanor. "Dr. Scott, I know you're familiar with the case, but Mr. Harris has requested that I take over this procedure." Rachel felt the familiar tension return, but nodded in understanding. He had specifically asked for Dr. William to perform the operation. As the attending surgeon, she accepted the change, though she knew her presence would likely be required if anything unexpected happened. "Very well, Dr. William. I'll remain in the room in case you need any assistance." Dr. William began the surgery with confidence and precision. However, as the procedure progressed, he encountered a particularly complicated obstruction. He attempted to remove it, but a small bleed began to obscure his vision and movements. Realizing the situation, Dr. William paused and looked at Rachel, motioning slightly for her to step closer. She moved toward the surgical table, adjusting the instruments to get a better view of the problematic area. "Dr. Scott, I think your expertise would be invaluable here. This injury is more complex than I anticipated." Rachel quickly took over, and with precise movements, she began addressing the situation. Within minutes, she stopped the bleeding and successfully cleared the obstruction. Dr. William observed with respect as she worked confidently and decisively. In less time than the team had expected, Rachel stabilized the patient's condition. At the end of the procedure, everyone in the room knew that she had resolved a situation that had become critical, and the relief was evident on their faces. After completing the surgery, Rachel left the room and headed to the recovery area to monitor John's condition. A week after the second surgery, when John Harris's condition seemed stabilized, Rachel was called to the hospital director's office. To her surprise, upon entering the room, she found John himself, accompanied by a lawyer and wearing a stern, resolute expression. He had decided to sue her, alleging negligence and medical error due to the complication after the first surgery. Rachel remained silent, listening as John and his lawyer presented their case. The accusations were pointed, and he insisted that the complication was caused by Rachel's lack of competence. Each word seemed carefully chosen to discredit her work and question her professional ability. She held her ground, determined to face the situation with the same calm she brought to any challenge. As John spoke, it became clear that his suspicions about her work, and her abilities were deeply rooted. The insinuations, the sharp tone, and his persistent demand for a second opinion all appeared part of a strategy to undermine her position. However, Rachel knew she had followed every protocol and that her actions during both surgeries had been impeccable. Days later, the hearing took place in a courtroom packed with journalists and curious onlookers. Rachel sat beside her lawyer, striving to remain composed, though she felt the weight of tension in her chest. John was present, and his demeanor reflected the confidence of someone who believed they were in control of the situation. Rachel's lawyer began her defense, presenting detailed records of the procedures and calling members of the surgical team to testify. Each witness confirmed that Rachel had adhered to all protocols and that her performance was precise and competent during both surgeries. At one point, Dr. William himself was called to the stand. He testified about how Rachel had assisted him during the second surgery, explaining the moment when, without her intervention, John's life might have been lost. She demonstrated exceptional skill and composure. In fact, it was Dr. Scott who stabilized the patient during a critical situation, saving his life once again. Dr. Williams' statement appeared to have an impact on the judge and the audience. However, John remained defiant, continuing to argue that Rachel had been negligent, insinuating that the initial complication only occurred due to her failure. But then, Rachel's lawyer made a dramatic pause, looked at the judge, and began to describe Rachel's background. Her years of dedication to the hospital and the frequency with which she faced scrutiny and requests for reviews, despite her flawless record. The lawyer highlighted how these recurring practices were often rooted in subtle and sometimes overt biases. He argued that the lawsuit against Rachel stemmed from prejudices and stereotypes rather than any genuine medical error. Next, the lawyer called a nurse to testify, someone who had worked directly with Rachel during both procedures and had been familiar with John's case from the beginning. The nurse recounted John's request for a second opinion and what she observed during their interactions. From the start, Mr. Harris seemed uncomfortable with Dr. Scott as his doctor. It was something we all noticed, even though he never openly expressed why. I never saw anything that justified his distrust. The nurse's testimony left the courtroom in silence. The tension heightened as Rachel's lawyer concluded, reinforcing the idea that John had pursued the lawsuit for reasons that went beyond any real medical concern. After a few hours of deliberation, the judge finally delivered the verdict. The court's decision struck like a thunderbolt. John Harris had lost, but deeper than the loss itself was the undeniable revelation that came with it. His life had been saved not just once, but twice by the very person he had doubted. Rachel's lawyer concluded the case with a powerful argument. Dr. Scott's history is not just one of excellence. It is a testament to resilience. She has faced scrutiny time and time again, often for reasons unrelated to her skill. This lawsuit is yet another reflection of the biases she has overcome, not a reflection of any professional fault. As the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. John Harris sat pale and incredulous, his once steadfast confidence crumbling. The judge emphasized that Rachel had adhered to every protocol, and that without her intervention, John might not be alive. After the hearing, Rachel felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It wasn't the first time she had faced implicit accusations, but this experience had been more draining than she anticipated. She knew it wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving, once again, that her abilities were beyond reproach, no matter who the patient was. 1 week later, John Harris returned to the hospital for a follow-up appointment. He entered with the same tense air as before, but there was a subtle change in his expression, something that mixed embarrassment with reluctance. Though the courtroom defeat was still a fresh wound, he couldn't avoid the recommended post-operative consultation. Rachel received the notification of John's arrival. She took a deep breath, preparing to face him again after the grueling trial. As she walked down the hallway toward the consultation room, she recalled every detail of the case, the harsh words, the accusations, and his relentless attempts to discredit her work. But, as always, she prioritized professionalism. When she entered the consultation room, John was seated, avoiding direct eye contact. Noticing her presence, he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, searching for a posture that might give him a sense of control. "Mr. Harris, thank you for coming. We're here to follow up on your recovery. I'll need to perform a brief evaluation and request some tests," she said, her voice firm and direct. He simply nodded, responding almost in a whisper. "Of course, do whatever's necessary." Rachel began reviewing his recent test results and asked questions about his physical state. John answered, but his gaze remained fixed on a distant point, avoiding prolonged eye contact. She completed the initial evaluation and made notes on her tablet, maintaining a professional silence. Finally, John broke the silence. I know this doesn't erase what happened, but..." He paused, searching for the right words. "Thank you for what you did in both surgeries." Rachel lifted her eyes, surprised by the hesitation in his voice. John seemed to struggle against his pride to admit any recognition, but there was something sincere in his thanks, even if it was hesitant. "I'm glad to see you recovering, Mr. Harris. That's what I'm here for." John remained silent for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, but something in him seemed to want to continue. He looked at his hands, then back at Rachel, and allowed himself to ask a question. "During the trial, when they mentioned what you went through to get here, was that true?" Rachel remained silent, analyzing his face. John's words were not merely out of curiosity. There was a hint of an attempt to understand, maybe even seek redemption, even if it was difficult to admit. "Yes, Mr. Harris. It was a long journey. I faced many barriers to be where I am, and I wasn't always welcomed with open arms, if that's what you mean." He nodded, processing what she said, and an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Rachel rarely talked about her journey, but in that moment, she realized it might be important for him to understand. After all, the recent trial wasn't just about her competence, but also about the prejudices she had faced for years. "You know, what happened between us wasn't the first time someone questioned my work without valid reasons. It's a constant burden, something I've learned to deal with." John took a deep breath, seeming to absorb every word. Finally, he lifted his eyes, revealing a sincerity Rachel had not seen in him before. "I didn't want to believe it, but I think I was one of those people, wasn't I? I questioned everything about you, every decision you made, and deep down, it wasn't about your work at all." Rachel simply observed him, letting him express himself. She saw he was processing something, facing a reality he had previously refused to acknowledge. He ran his hands over his face, as though trying to dissipate the weight of his embarrassment. "I lost the case, and that forced me to look at myself. And what I saw was hard to accept." Rachel's silence was not mere passivity. It carried the weight of countless similar encounters. Yet, as she saw John confront his prejudice, a flicker of hope emerged, subtle but profound. Perhaps, she thought, change was possible, even in the most unlikely hearts. "Reflection is the first step, Mr. Harris. For what it's worth, what matters to me is that I'm here to care for my patients, regardless of what they think. I'm good at what I do, and that's enough." John studied Rachel, and she noticed a mix of respect and regret in his gaze. He seemed to want to say more, but chose to simply nod silently. He rose slowly, his demeanor changed, perhaps by everything he had heard in that moment. He took a deep breath and, as he bid farewell, offered one last remark. "Thank you for opening my eyes." Days later, John Harris returned to the hospital for a final exam. This time, he seemed a bit less tense, but Rachel noticed a lingering heaviness in his expression. After the exams, he asked to speak with her, and they moved to a small consultation room. As they sat, John took the initiative to speak, his voice somewhat hesitant. "Dr. Scott, I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, especially what you said during our last meeting." Rachel watched him attentively, sensing he was about to say something significant. John intertwined his fingers, took a deep breath, and continued. "I never thought of myself as prejudiced. I always believed I was a fair person. But this case, and the way I treated you, it was like a mirror had been placed in front of me." Rachel remained silent, though her expression conveyed understanding of what he was trying to say. "I was wrong to question you the way I did. The truth is, I refuse to admit it. Maybe because he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, because I've never had to face those kinds of challenges. I've never had to prove anything to anyone just because of who I am." He looked at her, and Rachel saw that his usual pride had faded, replaced by a disarming sincerity. "I understand, Mr. Harris, and I appreciate your honesty. Admitting this is an important step." John nodded slowly. He seemed more vulnerable than he had ever shown before, and Rachel could see that this change wasn't easy for him. I thought I could hide my discomfort, but you must have noticed it from the beginning." He paused, and for the first time, his voice carried a hint of emotion. "I realized that all my resistance had nothing to do with your work. I just didn't want to admit what I was feeling." Rachel observed him silently, letting him express everything he needed. This was the kind of reflection he had to go through alone. Then, John took a deep breath and continued, his tone more solemn. "The truth is, I needed to go through the trial, lose the case, hear all the testimonies. All of that made me see who I really was. And now, as hard as it is, I wanted to apologize." Rachel remained silent for a few seconds, letting him feel the weight of his apology. She knew this moment was important for him. And while she had faced many situations like this before, she recognized that John's change was genuine. "I accept your apology, Mr. Harris, and I'm glad you've had this realization. It's something many people go their entire lives without seeing." John averted his gaze, as though processing her acceptance and trying to understand everything that moment represented. "You were more patient with me than I deserved. I acted as if I knew better, as if my opinion was more important. And the truth is, it wasn't." Rachel watched each word, each pause. She knew his journey was just beginning, but there was something deeply gratifying about seeing someone confront their own biases with humility. "I don't know if this makes up for what I did, but I want to become a better person. Someone people respect for who I am, not for who I thought I had to be." Rachel offered a slight smile, recognizing that this was as much sincerity as he could express. "Mr. Harris, acknowledging that is already a big step. The change you want only depends on you." John smiled, finally feeling a lightness that seemed absent throughout his hospital stay. He stood and extended his hand to Rachel, who shook it firmly, sealing the moment where pride and arrogance gave way to mutual respect. As John left the hospital, he paused for a moment, looking back at the building where so much had changed. The path to redemption would still be long, but he was determined to face it. After his final encounter with Rachel, John Harris left the hospital with a new perspective, but with the realization that he had much to learn. In the days that followed, he reflected on his actions, especially the prejudice he had once refused to acknowledge. He understood that it would take more than an apology to become a different person. 2 weeks later, after being officially discharged, John returned to the hospital for one last visit. He entered the lobby with a resolute expression, determined to see Rachel and express something he had been feeling since their last conversation. Rachel was in her office when she was informed of John's arrival. She hadn't expected to see him again, but agreed to meet him. A few minutes later he entered. carrying an envelope in his hands and looking more serene than before. She invited him to sit, and he obliged. "Dr. Scott, thank you for seeing me. I wanted to say a few things, and I thought it would be best to do it in person." Rachel nodded, maintaining her professional calm. "Of course, Mr. Harris. I'm glad to see you're doing well." He averted his eyes for a moment, carefully choosing his words. Then he took a deep breath and continued. "After everything you've been through, you still gave me the best care possible. You never failed in your commitment, even when I was behaving at my worst." Rachel offered a discreet smile, but allowed him to continue. "These past days have made me reflect on how much I need to change. And, even though I don't deserve it, I hope my apology was sincere enough." "It was sincere, Mr. Harris, and I'm pleased to know it's had a positive impact." He smiled faintly, though it seemed there was more he needed to say. The envelope in his hand hinted at another purpose for his visit. "For me, what happened here opened my eyes. I realized I need to give something back, something that shows I truly understood what you were trying to teach me, even without words." He extended the envelope to her. "I wanted to make a donation in your name, Dr. Scott. It's the least I can do." Rachel looked at him for a few seconds, surprised by the gesture. She accepted the envelope, nodding in gratitude. It was a significant donation, but more than that, it symbolized a change. "This means a lot, Mr. Harris. Your gesture will help many people, and I'm sure the hospital will be deeply grateful." He nodded, a glimmer of relief and newfound determination in his eyes. "I just hope that from now on, I can become someone who truly earns the respect I've tried to impose on others." "Thank you, Dr. Scott, for everything." Rachel smiled warmly and walked him to the office door. She watched as he left the hospital, this time with calm steps and a different posture, almost as if he had shed the weight he once carried. Months after his last consultation, John Harris returned to the hospital, this time with a special purpose. Since his experience with Rachel, he had dedicated himself to better understanding his own attitudes and the impact they had on others. His transformation had been a slow but genuine process, and he decided it was time to publicly acknowledge the influence Rachel had on his life. Rachel was giving a presentation at a hospital conference when, unexpectedly, the door opened and John entered, drawing the attention of the small audience of doctors, nurses, and other staff members. He walked to the center of the room, where Rachel was concluding her talk on advancements in surgery. She observed him with a mix of surprise and curiosity, unsure of the reason for his visit. John waited for everyone to settle and then asked for the floor. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "I apologize for interrupting, Dr. Scott, but I felt I needed to say something, and I wanted to do it in front of everyone." Rachel gestured for him to continue, and he took a deep breath, facing the full room. "Some of you may know me, and others may not. But what matters is that a few months ago, I was here not just as a patient, but as someone with a misguided perspective on people and myself." The hospital staff listened attentively, their eyes fixed on him. John appeared genuinely emotional as he continued. "I had the privilege of being treated by a professional who not only saved my life, but also made me see the person I had become. And, to be honest, I didn't like what I saw. However, Dr. Scott treated me with a respect I didn't deserve and did far more for me than I was able to recognize at the time." Rachel, touched by his words, watched as John paused to gather himself. He gripped the microphone tightly, clearly moved by what he was saying. "Dr. Scott had every reason to give up on me, my resistance, my arrogance, my relentless doubt. But instead of retreating, she stood firm, not only saving my life, but also revealing a truth I had long ignored. Who we are is defined by how we treat others, especially when they doubt us. She showed me, through her actions, that the value of a person goes far beyond appearances, prejudices, and judgments. And for that, I wanted to thank her publicly." The room fell silent for a moment before John pulled out a document from a folder, formalizing a significant donation in Rachel's name, aimed at funding scholarships for young medical students from underrepresented communities. In honor of Dr. Scott's tireless work and everything she represents, this donation is more than money. It is an acknowledgement of my past ignorance and a pledge to honor those who break barriers. May it open doors for future doctors whose brilliance, like Dr. Scott's, deserves every chance to shine. A murmur of surprise and approval spread through the room. Rachel, visibly moved, stood and approached John, who looked at her with a mix of respect and gratitude. "I don't even know what to say, Mr. Harris. This gesture means so much, not just to me, but to everyone who dreams of pursuing this profession and faces challenges." John smiled, visibly emotional, and extended his hand to shake hers. She took his hand, and for a moment, a deep mutual respect was shared between them. The audience rose to their feet, applauding, celebrating not just the donation, but also John's visible transformation. As John left the room, Rachel stood silently, watching the man who had once challenged her every step. In his departure, she saw not just redemption, but the quiet beginnings of a legacy, proof that courage and compassion could rewrite even the most stubborn of stories. How often do we judge someone based on their appearance, skin color, or unconscious biases, without considering their true worth? How would you handle a situation where you need to confront your own shortcomings? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us about your experiences. And don't forget to watch our other stories, filled with emotions and life lessons,